Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. The case first came to our attention, or should I say announced itself, in the last week of October in 1891, in such a strange and unsettling manner that even Holmes, who took pride in meeting eccentricity with cool indifference, was taken aback for a brief moment. The days had gotten shorter, the London air thicker with soot and autumnal damp, and our quarters at Baker Street took on a certain dismal coziness that promoted long silences and even longer lengths of idleness between cases. Holmes, for his part, had resigned himself to the peculiar type of sadness that assaults his restless intellect in the absence of a meaningful problem. For the past 3 days, he had only spoken in monosyllables, played his violin for hours with eerie dissonance, and eaten exactly 2 meals, neither of which would have satisfied a raven. I had tried to engage him in conversation about politics, poisons, and even the finer points of cricket, but with little success. It was on the 4th morning, just past 10, as the fog rolled off the rooftops in thick, ghostly tendrils, that Mrs. Hudson appeared with a sealed package on a silver tray. She made no attempt to conceal her uneasiness. "It was hand-delivered, Mr. Holmes. There's no return address." "The gentleman who delivered it wore a brown hat and did not wait," she continued, laying the letter down and backing away as if it could detonate. Holmes, who was sprawled over the settee with a Turkish slipper clutched to his chest, not for comfort, but for its unconventional store of powerful tobacco, raises an eyebrow. With a quick impulse that astonished even me, he swung his legs to the floor and snatched the envelope, scrutinizing it not with wonder, but with mistrust. The parchment was of decent quality, but not gaudy. The handwriting was clean and deliberate in black ink, with an unusual regularity that Holmes noticed right away. "See here, Watson," he said quietly. "The script is overly symmetrical, possibly authored by a machine, or more likely by a person who has been educated to write like one. Perhaps it was a clerk's hand. But there's something else. Do you see it?" I leaned in. "There's no watermark, but the ink is a little faded. Could it have been written a while ago?" "Possibly," Holmes murmured, already sliding his knife under the seal. The inside contained a single piece of paper, no signature and no formal greeting. The line, "At precisely 2:31 p.m. tomorrow, Lord Charles Drelincourt will be dead," stands out on the page. I sensed a cool draft, even though the fireplace behind me was burning. Holmes read the sentence twice, then again loudly, as if to measure its weight in air. "Lord Drelincourt," I repeated. I recognized the name. A peer in the realm. I suppose he was in the Queen's Council for some years. He still sits in the House of Lords, does not he? "Indeed," Holmes replied. "And more importantly, he is not at this moment dead. Could this be a hoax? That depends on whether it is true. But how can one know the time of death in advance?" "Quite," Holmes said with a sparkle in his eye. "That, Watson, is precisely why we shall pay Lord Drelincourt a visit." Within 20 minutes, Holmes had transformed himself from a lethargically dressed opiate to the hawk-like logician praised by the tabloids. By 11:30, we were rattling through the streets of London in a hansom cab, Holmes chewing thoughtfully on the end of his glove and me scrutinizing the fog-muffled outlines of buildings as we passed. "I take it you know more of Lord Drelincourt than you let on?" I inquired as we headed toward Belgravia. "He is, by all public accounts, a man of impeccable repute," Holmes said. "However, as we all know, reputation is an easily drawn curtain. He amassed a fortune from Indian railway enterprises. I believe those dealings resulted in a large number of enemies. He has recently withdrawn from society, described as a guy plagued by an unknown force, and the specific time, 2:31 p.m., that suggests premeditation." "It suggests knowledge," Holmes corrected me. "And knowledge implies proximity, my dear Watson. One does not anticipate the moment a guy will die by coincidence. If Lord Drelincourt dies tomorrow at 2:31, it will be by his own or someone else's design. And in either scenario, the author of this letter is dangerously knowledgeable." We arrived at Drelincourt House just before midday. The estate was huge but quiet, a Georgian facade of grey stone, lofty windows and trimmed hedges. A butler met us at the door, frowning at our request to speak with the lord of the house. He does not receive visitors without an appointment. The man answered stiffly. Then inform him, he said, that Sherlock Holmes comes bearing a message that pertains to the precise moment of his death. That, as one might assume, did the trick. Lord Charles Drelincourt greeted us in a drawing-room filled with filtered light from leaded windows. He was around 60 years old, spare and aristocratic, with a haggard look that suggested long-term anxiety. As Holmes recited the message aloud, the colour faded from his face completely. He stood holding the back of a chair. "Tomorrow," he muttered. "At 2:31? You've heard something similar before?" Holmes inquired, examining his face attentively. The elderly guy nodded slowly. "Just 2 days ago, I received a note, not unlike yours. But it merely stated, 'Your time is nigh.' I dismissed it as a cruel joke. I receive numerous. But this," he gestured toward the page Holmes now held between his fingers. "To name the hour, it's no joke. It's a sentence. You must allow me full access to your staff, your house, and your schedule for tomorrow," Holmes told me with firmness. "I intend to be present when the clock strikes 2:31. Then you believe I shall die?" Holmes's gaze hardened. "No, Lord Drelincourt. I believe someone believes you will. And that belief, if armed with resources and opportunity, becomes very nearly prophecy." With that, the case began, not with carnage or bodies, but with a clock ticking steadily toward a predetermined end. Lord Drelincourt paced before the hearth, his slender hands clutched tightly behind his back. Holmes remained sitting. The slight click of the clock on the mantel was no longer a background murmur, but a constant metronome of dread. What exactly did the earlier note say? Holmes inquired, still holding the letter we'd brought. Drelincourt halted and looked at a bureau in the corner. "I believe I kept it." He stepped stiffly across the room and pulled out a drawer, revealing a folded piece of paper. Holmes extended his hand and the Lord gave it up without struggle. Holmes unfolded the message. It was only 5 words long and written in the same inflexible, mechanical form. "Your time is near, Charles. There is no date. There's no sender. Just a quiet threat delivered with disconcerting assurance." Holmes compared the paper, ink, and handwriting to a death note. After a moment he nodded, same hand, same stationery. Based on the flow pattern, this is most likely the same ink reservoir. But the transition from a vague threat to precise date is substantial. Drelincourt slumped slightly in the chair opposite us. His expression had abandoned any pretense of dignity. "I don't know who could wish me dead, Mr. Holmes," he added calmly. "I have lived quietly for the past 5 years. My dealings in the East were not without difficulties, I admit, but I never dealt in arms or opium. I invested and consulted, and retired. I haven't had enemies who would go to such extent." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Enemies rarely make themselves known, Lord Drelincourt, but they frequently keep time." He stood up and approached the nearest window, pulled the curtain back a few inches to observe the street below. "This house, who resides here now?" "Myself," the peer explained. "My valet and the housekeeper. Mrs. Bainbridge has been with the family for nearly 20 years. My valet Harding only joined me last spring. Nobody else is in regular residence. I don't entertain any guests. Your family?" "My wife died 6 years ago. No children. Anne Halbert, a niece, makes occasional visits. She's currently attending university in Edinburgh." Holmes turned to face him. "And do you believe either of your staff could be compromised?" Drelincourt blinked. "No, certainly not Mrs. Bainbridge. And Harding, while possibly a little ambitious, has done nothing wrong. Efficient, polite, and discreet. May I speak with them?" "Yes, of course." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, would you please accompany Lord Drelincourt to collect the housekeeper? I will inspect the front hallway and letterbox." I followed the peer along the corridor. The house was sparsely adorned. Oil pictures hung in long wooden frames, and the rugs were of muted tones. It was the home of a man who previously had fortune, but had since withdrawn from society. We passed a grandfather clock that struck the quarter hour as we walked toward the servants' wing. Mrs. Bainbridge was a severe-looking woman with greying hair put into a tight bun. Her demeanour was cool, but her eyes expressed concern when told about the letter. "I've worked for Lord Drelincourt since 1873, she stated with serene contempt. I nursed his wife through illness and I don't get scared easily. But I do not like this, sir. There is a heaviness about the house recently, as if something was pressing down. Have you noticed any strangers or unusual parcels? She shakes her head. Nothing unusual, sir, only... She paused. Yes? I prompted. Only Lord Drelincourt had a visitor last week. A young woman. She was wearing gloves and a hat with a green ribbon. I wasn't introduced. She arrived shortly after dark, stayed for no more than 20 minutes and then left without revealing her name. She was upset when she came, angry. Did she speak loudly? No, but her voice carried up from the parlor, and I heard her say, "He's dead because of you." Only once. Then she left. I thanked her and returned to Holmes in the foyer, where he was crouching at the base of the letterbox, holding a magnifying lens. Someone has tampered with this, he added, without looking up. The latch was recently oiled, note the residue on the brass, but not by a professional. It has been opened from the inside and pushed back into position. I suppose our note writer hand-delivered it via this slot rather than posting it. Then he knows the house, I said. He does. And he has the confidence to come right up to the threshold. Now, what about Mrs. Bainbridge? When I told Holmes the story about the woman with the green ribbon, his eyes lit up. An accusation of death, he said quietly. Past guilt is often the source of future violence. We must identify this visitor. At that moment, the valet, Harding, entered the entryway. He was a wiry man of around 35, with perfectly combed hair and gloved hands. His eyes flashed rapidly between us, and he gave a respectful bow. "Mr. Holmes, I understand you wish to speak with me." "Yes, I do, Mr. Harding. Please allow me to ask a few simple questions. Have you seen anything strange in Lord Drelincourt's emails recently?" Harding paused. "Only that there has been less of it. For months I've received fewer than one letter every week. The Lord has become reclusive. And you collect the post?" "Yes, sir. Every morning I retrieve it from the box. Yesterday, however, I discovered nothing." "Do you lock the front door at night?" "Always, sir." "I check it myself at 10 o'clock. A note appears without your awareness. Do you see the difficulty?" Harding appeared agitated for a brief moment. "It must have been snuck in the afternoon. I was away on an errand for Lord Drelincourt, fetching his walking stick from the cobbler." Holmes considered him in quiet for a moment. Then he replied, "Very well. That's all, thank you." After Harding had left, Holmes turned to me with calm focus. He lied about his walking stick. His shoes show no traces of grime or fresh polish. No smudges from a recently repaired cane. Either the errand never took place or he went elsewhere. "You suspect him?" "I suspect nothing yet. I observe. But he isn't our only person of interest." Holmes took out his notebook. "We must find out who the woman who paid us a visit last week is. We'll start with local cabbies. A woman wearing a green ribbon is not easily forgotten." We spent the following hour interrogating drivers at a booth near Eaton Square. Most were unhelpful, but an older cab driver named Mullins remembered picking up a young woman near Drelincourt House around a week ago. "She was upset," Mullins explained. "She kept her head low. I was told to drive her to Wyndham Street, corner of St. Aloysius Chapel. That is all she said." "Did she give a name?" "No, sir." Holmes jotted down the location. "That's not far from the university dormitories, Watson. Let's pay a visit." As the fog increased, we reached Wyndham Street. It was a peaceful row of houses near Bloomsbury, some let to students, some to artists and professors. At number 12, a narrow door was left open. Holmes knocked gently. A young woman with auburn hair and sharp eyes looked out. "Yes?" Holmes tilted his head. "Forgive the intrusion, miss. We are looking into an issue of significant concern to Lord Drelincourt." "Oh, you saw him last week?" She narrowed her eyes. "And who are you, to ask?" "I am Sherlock Holmes." That, as usual, was plenty. She opened the door. "My name is Lillian Morse. I was engaged to my brother's business partner. My brother died 3 years ago. Mr. Drelincourt financed the venture. And—" She paused, pressing a hand to her lips. "And you believe he was responsible?" Holmes inquired kindly. "I do not know. But I know my brother signed documents he did not understand. After 6 months, he drowned in Calcutta. Drelincourt said it was an accident. I have always wondered." Holmes moved back into the chilly air, his eyes narrowing with new ferocity. "Come, Watson," he called. "We're running out of hours. The clock ticks not only toward a murder, but also toward a meeting with justice that has been planned for years." As we returned to Baker Street, The chill followed us like a shadow. We returned to Baker Street with the fog clinging to our overcoats and the aroma of damp coal smoke in our nostrils. Holmes said little during the cab trip, his gaze set someplace beyond the window pane, but his fingers slid restlessly along the ridge of his knee in a slow, rhythmic tap. I recognized the approach. His ideas had begun to merge, but the structure had not yet been completed. The fragments of truth were scattered yet, and Holmes, like a master architect, would not speak until the beams were secured in place. Mrs. Hudson had spread out tea and scones by the fire as we entered the sitting room, but Holmes disregarded both. He went straight to the sideboard, pulled out his files, and quickly glanced through a collection of folders organized not alphabetically, but by proximity of consequence. Within moments, he had found what he was looking for, a compact dossier labeled Calcutta Holdings. 1887 Lillian Morse's brother, Holmes continued, sinking into his chair, was Gerald Morse, an accountant schooled in Cambridge and assigned to Calcutta by Drelincourt's trade interests. His death was judged an accidental drowning. But, he removed a yellowed sheet, the body was never recovered. Only one boot washed ashore. The man who signed the death affidavit was Mr. John Halberd. Have you noticed the name, Watson? Halberd? But that is Lillian's surname, indeed. A cousin. Lillian's uncle, to be exact. This implies that the family's involvement with Drelincourt is more extensive than she previously stated. I assume this entanglement is more intricate than she realizes, or was ready to admit. I laid my cup down, the warmth gone. Do you believe Lord Drelincourt killed her brother? Holmes laced his fingers. I think he gained from his death. And I suppose someone else blames him. Whether real or not, someone has decided to make him pay for it now, with the clock striking 2:31. What about Harding, the valet? Could he be in league with this woman? Possibly. He lied about his whereabouts. And unless he's pathologically forgetful, no man leaves a cobbler's shop with his shoes unblemished and his sleeves undisturbed. Holmes stood quickly and walked to the window, where the gaslight flickered behind the glass. The city was ready for the evening. He checked his watch. Watson, tomorrow's deadline is fast approaching. We need to return to Drelincourt House tonight. I aim to stay there till the allotted hour. Whoever intends to strike will have made preparations already. If there is a weapon, it is hidden, or the approach is even more covert. You suspect poison? Not in the obvious sense. Drelincourt's health is stable, and the note implies certainty over chance. This is not a threat, but a statement. That is, our killer must believe they have control over the hour. When we returned to the Belgravia house, the lamps in the lower windows had been turned on, and the rooms were dimly lighted behind lace curtains. Lord Drelincourt met us in the drawing-room, his face drawn but composed. I've ordered that your rooms be prepared, he told Holmes. I have to admit that your presence brings me some comfort. It is strange, Mr. Holmes, to wait for your own death while the world continues to turn. Holmes gave a tight smile. It is odder still to await something one intends to prevent. We thoroughly examined the estate that evening. Holmes looked at the windows, locks, staircases, chimneys, and even the underneath of the dining table. He investigated each vent and examined the fireplace flue in the study, where Drelincourt frequently worked alone. Nothing remarkable revealed itself. Yet Holmes' demeanor did not soften. Note, Watson, he continued as we stood in the dim library, that this room is in the heart of the house. Just one entry, one window secured from the inside. If I had to stage a death without a trace, I would do so here. How? That's what remains to be found. Following supper, Holmes requested to view Lord Drelincourt's personal letters over the previous 6 months. The man hesitated. Clearly some letters included sensitive or traumatic information, but eventually relented. Holmes read silently, placing aside 3 envelopes. These, he replied, are from a solicitor named Mr. Leonard Craik. They refer to modifications in Drelincourt's will. The peer blushed slightly. After Lillian's charges, I rewrote my testimony. I had left her a small bequest, but I revoked it. Holmes arched his brows. That was unwise. I felt betrayed, perhaps. But removing a woman from a will reinforces her belief that you are guilty, and it provides motivation for anyone close to her who hoped to benefit. You think she may be behind this? I believe she may be involved, but I doubt she is the one who will strike. As the clock approached midnight, we retired to our respective rooms. Holmes declined a bed and took a chair in the hallway, directly across from Drelincourt's study, with a newspaper folded in his lap and his revolver in his pocket. I offered to remain with him, but he dismissed me. "Sleep, Watson. Tomorrow will demand your attention and steadiness. I will not rest until the bell tolls." The night passed in eerie silence. I awoke several times, hearing only the ticking of the old grandfather clock down the corridor. When I opened my door around 3 p.m., I found Holmes still sitting and staring intently at the study door. He raised his hand in silent assurance. When I came out at 8:30, he had vanished. I found him in the kitchen, sipping a bitter-smelling beverage and questioning Mrs. Bainbridge about the house's ventilation system. "Nothing flows from the upper corridor into the study," she assures him. "It was sealed years ago after a chimney fire." Yet someone could enter the room, only from the door or the window. "The window hasn't been opened in years. Painted shut." Harding appeared shortly thereafter, looking freshly shaven and unnaturally cheerful. Holmes greeted him politely, but watched him like a hawk. As noon drew near, Holmes requested that all servants remain in the front portion of the house. Lord Drelincourt retired to his study with the Times and a glass of port, insisting on facing his fate alone. Holmes and I concealed ourselves in the small parlour opposite the study. The door was ajar, offering a view of the hallway. Holmes had laid a thin string, almost invisible, across the base of the study door, affixed to a small bell in our room. "Not foolproof," he whispered, "but it will tell us if the door is opened." He checked his watch. 12:42. Time passed slowly, each minute swallowed in silence. Outside, a drizzle began to patter against the windows, faint and persistent. Holmes did not move. His eyes flicked between the clock and the bell. At 1:55, I saw him shift, his fingers tightening on his cane. At 2:12, the faintest sound, no more than a breath, came from down the corridor. Holmes froze, then moved swiftly toward the hallway on silent feet. I followed. From the rear servants' corridor, a shadow passed. Holmes lunged forward and pulled the intruder into view, a cloaked figure, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. It was Lillian Morse. Holmes did not release her arm. "You are not here by accident, Miss Morse." "I had to see," she stammered. "I had to know if he would die." The clock began to chime 2:30. Holmes released her and turned, striding quickly to the study door. Silence. He pushed it open. Lord Drelincourt was seated at his desk upright, his fingers around the stem of the port glass, and he was not moving. Holmes crossed the room in 3 strides, placed 2 fingers to the man's neck and drew in a breath. He turned slowly toward me. "Dead," he said. The bell did not ring. No one had entered, and yet the death had arrived at precisely 2:31. Holmes straightened, his eyes narrowing. "Now," he murmured, "the case truly begins." The stillness in the study was absolute, as though even the dust motes in the filtered light had frozen in astonishment. Lord Drelincourt sat as if caught mid-thought, his eyes half closed, his expression curiously peaceful. The port glass trembled faintly between his fingers, stilled only by the rigidity of death. The clock on the mantel had just marked the 31st minute past 2, its brass hands unwavering, as if fate itself were punctual. Holmes remained immobile for a few moments, his hand still poised from where it had tested for a pulse. Then slowly he withdrew, his eyes sweeping the room with chilling precision. He said nothing to me, nor to Miss Morse, who stood just outside the door, trembling silently. I stepped in behind him, my medical instincts already responding. But as I bent beside the chair, checking pulse, breath, pupils, my own breath caught. "No marks," I whispered. "No signs of struggle, no bruising. And the eyes, no dilation. This was not a violent death." "Correct," Holmes murmured. "And yet it was foretold, orchestrated, and timed to the minute. Which tells us far more about the killer than any poison vial ever could." He approached the small table by the window, where the port bottle was uncorked. He studied the bottle's mouth, sniffed it, and repeated the process with the contents of the glass. There is no bitter fragrance. There are no almond traces. There is no clouding in the liquid. He stared at me. "Watson." I took the glass and slowly raised it, let the light through. Then I dipped a finger and touched it to my tongue. There's nothing distinct. There's no metallic flavor. However, certain toxins are subtle enough to elude the senses. We'll require a complete analysis. Holmes nodded. but his attention had already shifted elsewhere. He toured the room once more, this time taking special attention to the air vents and the heavy velvet drapes that framed the sealed window. "Miss Morse," he said without raising his voice, "was it your intention to prevent his death?" She looked up, surprised. "No, I merely wanted to know if the letter was true." "I didn't know, but somebody knew. Someone wanted you here. That much is apparent. This wasn't just a murder. It was a performance, and you were supposed to be among the crowd." I moved closer to the desk, where a few letters lay unopened. Drelincourt's pen remained undisturbed next to the blotter. There was no indication he had felt danger. "Don't panic. No resistance. You said he was not ill," I mumbled to Holmes. "Correct. I haven't had a cold in months." And yet he dies, painlessly and without alarm, on the exact minute specified by his would-be executioner. This was not spontaneous. It was engineered. He turned back to face Lillian Morse. "Tell me, have you spoken with anyone at all, about your visit last week?" "No," she answered vaguely. "Just my uncle, Mr. Halberd. I asked him for advice. He was a buddy of Lord Drelincourt before becoming my brother." Holmes furrowed his brow. "Mr. John Halberd, who signed the death affidavit for your brother?" "Yes, however, he departed India shortly after. He has lived quietly in Sussex ever since. I went to see him last month. Did he advise you to visit Drelincourt?" She paused. "Yes, he did. He suggested if I wanted peace, I needed to address the man personally. That I wouldn't stop till I looked him in the eyes." Holmes gave a curt nod. "Then we must speak with Mr. Halberd." He turned abruptly. "Watson, stay here and attend to the post-mortem arrangements. Request an emergency toxicological inspection of the port. Have summoned Lestrade, but have not yet informed him about the death. I'll return shortly." I opened my mouth to protest. Holmes was about to leave alone on what could be the most important lead thus far, but the look he gave me was stern and unwavering. "Watson, time is our adversary now. Someone has taken remarkable effort to make this death appear inevitable. That demands more than murder. It requires control." With that he swept out, leaving Miss Morse following behind him, her shoulders hunched against the fall chill. I stayed with the body for about an hour. When Harding and Mrs. Bainbridge were informed, they reacted with the expected mix of shock and solemnity, albeit I saw the former's hand trembled more than one would anticipate. I filed a request for chemical tests with the medical examiner and dispatched a courier to Scotland Yard, instructing Lestrade to arrive discreetly. By the time Holmes returned, dusk had begun to fall over the city. He entered the study alone, his face pallid and drawn in a way I hadn't seen since the incident on Blackheath Moor. Without saying anything, he removed his coat and sat in the chair opposite Drelincourt's, which was now pleasantly empty. "Well?" I asked quietly. "John Halberd is dead," he announced bluntly. I stared at him. "Dead? Just 2 days ago." He was struck by a hansom cab while crossing the street near his home. I was told that they died instantly. Nonetheless, his manservant claims Halberd has not received any visits in the last month. No young woman, no niece, but Lillian. Lillian Morse isn't his niece. There is no Lillian Morse on the Edinburgh University record. There is no Lillian Morse linked to Gerald Morse's estate. That's not a real name. Carefully applied. I felt a chill sink in. You're saying she isn't who she claimed to be? I'm suggesting she was placed in our path on purpose. She was meant to lead us down a false path. The true question is why? Why all the pageantry? Why the letters, the date, and the staging of the study as a tomb? I looked at him. But Holmes truly died. She was there. She couldn't have given anything, Holmes stood. Unless the poison had already been administered. But the port, not the port, he answered with narrowed eyes. There's something else. Something consumed previously. Perhaps a capsule that produces a delayed reaction. Perhaps even inhaled. We'll know more after the examination is over. He turned toward the window, pacing with fresh zeal. But whomever she is, she has disappeared. And that, Watson, is the most deadly indicator of all. A killer who lingers is a criminal. A killer who vanishes is an artist. There was a knock on the front door. Moments later, Lestrade entered the study, cap in hand, his customary bravado muted by Holmes's strong request for caution. Holmes delivered the crucial data with his customary precision, omitting only the mystery woman's fabricated identity, which he plainly planned to keep hidden for the time being. "Death at 2:31 exactly," Lestrade said, glancing at his notes. You've seen a lot of murders, Holmes, but never one scheduled in advance, which is precisely why we must ask, who benefits most from a death foretold? Lestrade blinked. The killer, I suppose. Exactly. And when a killer is bold enough to publicize the time, you have to wonder what drove them to do so. Vanity, perhaps. In most cases, Watson, Holmes turned to me, his voice low, it is to ensure alibi. With that single word, the room seems to shut in on us once more. The killer had not only taken a life, but he had done so with the accuracy of a ticking watch, and he may now be sitting miles away, laughing peacefully behind the secure veil of time. The study became colder as the hour passed, but Holmes, Lestrade, and I paid no attention to the creeping coldness. The open door, the extinguished fire, the echo of a death so punctual it defied chance, all conspired to make the air feel dense with calculation. Lestrade stood stiffly near the fireplace, flipping through his notebook with unusual quiet, while Holmes walked in measured loops around the room, his gaze sweeping over the same furnishings he had already examined a dozen times, as if waiting for the room to reveal its secrets. "The autopsy will confirm it," Lestrade announced, breaking the silence. "But there is no bruising or evidence of cardiac failure, according to the doctor's preliminary examination." The fellow simply stopped. Holmes stopped pacing. "Men do not simply cease," he observed. "Even in the quietest murders there is a means. And where there are means there is intention. And if there is aim, we must ask, when was it planted, how was it planted, and by whom?" He returned to his desk and gestured to the glass. "You are having the port tested?" "It's already gone to the lab," Lestrade affirmed. "But the technician said it would take at least a day, maybe two, to get full results. Subtle poisons make subtle imprints." Holmes nodded curtly. "Then we can't wait for the chemistry. We must trace the theater. This death was not unintentional. It was a rehearsal." Lestrade scratched his chin. "What about the woman, Lillian Morse, or whatever she was? Should I circulate a description?" Holmes shakes his head. "Not yet. When she realizes she's being pursued, she'll hide behind a dozen layers of deception. She was never meant to be visible. She was a voice, a mask, and a trigger. We'll locate her, but not by chasing shadows. First, we must rebuild the pathway to this room." He went toward the door and motioned for us to follow. "We start with the study itself. Watson, you and I swept it thoroughly before the hour came. No entry, no breach. The bell line remained undisturbed. However, the sufferer died precisely at the predicted time, so the agent, whatever it was, had already been set in motion prior to that hour. He ingested, breathed, or was exposed to it in the hours before. We must now determine when." Lestrade and I followed Holmes down the corridor to the dining room, where lunch had been served. A covered plate sat at the head of the table, undisturbed since the butler had removed the body. Holmes examined it with gloves, removing the lid to reveal traces of sliced veal and potatoes. "This was served to Drelincourt around 1:15, according to Mrs. Bainbridge," Holmes said. "No food has been consumed since. This prevents intake of this food. The port also exhibits no signs of manipulation. So we must leave early." He entered the kitchen, where Harding was now aiding the cook in gloomy obedience. Holmes addressed the valet without preface. "Breakfast, what was served, and when?" Harding blinked. "Sir, 8 eggs, toast, and a cup of chocolate. As usual, I prepared it myself at 8 o'clock sharp." "He ate in his study. Any visitors between then and midday?" "No, sir. He stayed in his study, went for a quick walk around 11, and then returned." Holmes stared at me. "Take that walk. Did you notice anything when we arrived?" I attempted to recall. "Only that he seemed little tired. But given the conditions, it appeared natural." Holmes turned back to Harding. "Did he talk to anyone throughout the walk? Has he left the property?" "No, sir. He remained within the garden walls. I walked for around 5 minutes. I watched him through the window." Holmes nodded, then returned his focus to the cup on the breakfast tray, which was still drying near the basin. He took it up, sniffed it lightly, and grimaced. "Cocoa, rich and thick. Do you prepare this daily?" "Each morning, yes. This is Lord Drelincourt's preference." "He disliked tea. Did you taste it?" "I beg your pardon, sir?" Holmes's voice became sharper. "Did you taste it before serving?" The valet flushed. "Certainly not. I never do." Holmes said nothing, but I could see the deduction coming. If the cocoa had been drugged, it would have had plenty of time to take effect by mid-afternoon, especially if the agent was slow-acting. "Delayed onset," Holmes gave the cup to Lestrade. "That needs to be tested beside the port. If the poison had been administered earlier, it would have provided ample cover for our killer's disappearance. They would only have to make sure the victim was in the right room at the right time, and everything else would fall into place. But how would they know the poison would act exactly at 2:31? I asked. "They wouldn't," Holmes replied. "However, they would compute the window, and then create the illusion around it. The message, the exact minute, was not a guarantee. It was a script. If Drelincourt had died at 2:28 or 2:35, we may have considered it a coincidence. However, the message predisposed our minds to see the moment as predetermined. That's the real trick." Lestrade stared at Holmes. "So the killer gambled that the poison would appear precise." Holmes' eyes glittered. "A gambler with a loaded deck." We returned to the drawing room, and Holmes asked Mrs. Bainbridge for the household accounting ledger. She retrieved it reluctantly. He flipped over the last 3 months with deliberate quickness. "There," he replied, tapping a little entry. "October 7th, a cocoa delivery from Harrington & Sons. An unusual supplier. Lord Drelincourt normally orders from Harrods." He flopped back. "No previous purchases from this company." This was a special order. Lestrade peered at the line. "Think the poison came in the cocoa?" "I think it may have been the cocoa. Then the killer would have had to arrange the delivery." "Indeed. And having access to Drelincourt's accounts, or at least control over the ordering process." Holmes looked up sharply and coldly. "We must find out who initiated that order." A knock on the door halted us. A constable had arrived carrying a message. Lestrade read aloud the preliminary analysis results, which identified a trace alkaloid compound. Symptoms correspond to the consumption of a modified version of digitalin, a cardiac suppressor. The time of impact is expected to be between 5 and 7 hours after administration, depending on the dosage. Exceptionally difficult to detect on ordinary inspection. Holmes closed his eyes. Digitalin. Derived from foxglove, clean, slow, and invisible in liquid. He breathed slowly. "It was the cocoa." Lestrade grimaced. "So the girl, whoever she is, dosed it, vanished, and let the rest play out?" "No," Holmes said. "She had not prepared the cocoa. Harding did." The room became quiet. Holmes turned to me. "Remember what he said?" He watched the walk from the window. "Never leave the kitchen. The only one having access to both the drink and the research." Lestrade's jaw tightened. "We arrest him now?" "Not yet," Holmes replied. "He's overly careful, too calculating. We need proof to secure the rope tightly." Holmes approached the hearth and gazed into the icy grate. "We're almost there, though. The trap must be set and the bait laid. Allow him to believe the prophecy fulfilled. Let him celebrate, and then—" He looked at me. "We shall see if the killer who knew the hour of death also knows how to escape the hour of justice." The shadows of Drelincourt House increased with the approach of nightfall, though the gas lamps had been lit and every fire renewed. There was an unspoken tension in the air, hanging like fog beneath the chandeliers and across the walnut planks. The study had been shuttered, and the body had been removed, but the emptiness resonated with too much intent. Holmes had not sat since returning. He strolled silently, hands laced behind his back, past the same image of Lady Drelincourt repeatedly, without looking up at her eyes. Lestrade had departed, vowing to quietly check Harrington & Sons and its delivery records. I remained with Holmes in the drawing room, watching him circle like a barometer before a storm. I recognized the indications. He was no longer trying to figure out what had happened. He was planning how to catch it again. "It is not enough to know," he finally concluded, pausing in front of the hearth. "The law does not move on logic alone, Watson. It wants proof. It requires timestamps, fingerprints, and names in black ink. But this killer has given us none. No traces, no signatures, and no boasts. Only a theater. And Harding?" I asked. "Do you believe he acted alone?" Holmes took a slow breath. "He isn't clever enough to create the illusion of prophecy. His role is practical. Poison in the cup. The procedure followed, and the alibi was established. But someone else had pulled the string from above. Someone handed him his half. I stood and poured another measure of brandy. Holmes dismissed it with a toss of his head. "If Harding is our agent," I responded, "then the woman, Miss Morse or whoever she is, must be the one who built the legend." "Precisely. She encouraged us to consider death as inevitability. That was the entire point, to ensure that no one suspected murder, until it was too late to solve the case. She planted the seed and Harding reaped the benefits, But why go through such effort? I asked. Why not simply kill the man and leave it at that? Holmes turned, his eyes now piercing beneath the gloom. Because this didn't involve death, Watson. It was all about control. The kind of control that allows someone to announce a man's death like a train arrives, and then watch it happen with pinpoint accuracy. The room fell quiet again. The muffled clang of a church bell rang out from beyond the walls, 6 chimes in slow succession. Holmes moved suddenly. Come, I followed him without question. He led me through the servants' wing, past the empty scullery and down the stone steps to the cellar. He lingered at the pantry door before returning his attention to me. If Harding is involved, he added, his confidence will let us know. He believes the trail is cold. He believes he has done his part and that no one suspects him. Holmes pulled open the door and walked inside. Harding was there, folding cloth napkins into a drawer, his expression as calm as if he were preparing for a dinner that would never arrive. Ah, Mr. Holmes, he responded. Can I be of assistance? Holmes gave a faint smile. You already have. But I find myself inquisitive about your prior employment. Harding hesitated slightly. I was with the Glastons before Lord Drelincourt. For 4 years, and before that, a short-term position in Shropshire. I left in search of better opportunities. Of course, Holmes replied gently. You seem a man of habit. And Lord Drelincourt appreciated his routines, did he not? Harding nodded. Yes, sir. Breakfast at 8, stroll at 11, and study until noon. Holmes's voice altered just a bit. And cocoa? Each morning, yes. Tell me, Holmes inquired casually, do you taste it before serving? Harding's eyes flickered for a half-second, little more than a blink, but Holmes noticed it. He let the stillness hang, not as a threat, but as a burden, until Harding looked down. No, the valet replied. I've told you, I never do. Of course, Holmes replied. Only a professional would risk such trust. He offered a brief nod and turned away, leaving the man folding napkins in a little faster beat. In the corridor, Holmes said quietly, he is nervous but not broken. This means that we must break him, not with accusations, with certainty. The doorbell rang just as I was about to ask what he meant. A boy had arrived with a telegram. Holmes opened it and read it out loud. Harrington Records. Confirm cocoa ordered by phone. Payment in cash anonymous. Delivery to Lord D's residence Lestrade. Holmes folded the slip precisely. A ghost placed that order. No name, no trace. However, they were aware of the appropriate time to deliver. This offers us a thread. Watson, do you remember the mail Drelincourt received the day before the letter? I nodded. Mrs. Bainbridge said there had been less correspondence lately. Then we must investigate what arrived. He might have received something else, a final nudge, an incentive. Maybe even instructions. Within minutes, we had gained access to the little cabinet in Lord Drelincourt's study, where he kept his unopened letters. Among the few items was an unusual envelope, with no stamp and no return address. The letter contained a single page of unlined thick paper, with a brief note. Please stay in the study until 3 p.m. tomorrow. To do otherwise means risking more than death. It was unsigned. But it's the same strict script as the death notification. Holmes held it up to the light. Embossed, he answered. This is expensive stock. However, they are anonymous. This was not sent by post. It was inserted silently, possibly during night. This message did not warn him that he would die. It commanded him to make it possible, so he was manipulated into isolating himself. Exactly. We now understand why everything went so smoothly. The victim's routine was not a coincidence. It was engineered. The killer predicted more than just the hour. They scheduled it. Holmes folded the note and turned towards the door. It's time, Watson. For what? To force a second performance. We returned to the drawing room and Holmes requested Mrs. Bainbridge to summon Harding. The man appeared quickly, remaining composed, but his fingers showed a tiny trembling. Holmes motioned for him to sit. I have news, Holmes stated evenly. We have reviewed the letter sent to Lord Drelincourt, commanding him to remain in the die study. Harding's throat twitched, but he did not say anything. We have matched the script to the death note. There's still stillness. We have determined that the cocoa was contaminated with a cardiac chemical. Digitalin is administered slowly. It was not an accident. Harding's jaw twitched. And the final element, Holmes added, leaning in and speaking quietly, We have recovered the receipt from Harrington and Sons. The order was placed with your voice. There was a pause, a strained, stretched instant in which the room appeared. To cease breathing, Harding said nothing. Holmes stood. You will be arrested within the hour. Then he turned and exited the room. Followed. Outside in the corridor, I hissed, Holmes, that was a bluff. We don't have a voice sample. I know, he muttered. But Harding doesn't. Within 10 minutes, we heard a slight creak as the pantry door opened. Then the back door. Then I heard faint footsteps in the alley beyond. Holmes rose, took his hat, and simply stated, Let the fox run. Now we follow the scent. And we plunged into the cold London night. The hunt finally begun. The night air hit us hard as we slipped into the foggy alley behind Drelincourt House. Holmes moved like a panther, taking long, deliberate strides, his gaze drawn not to the road ahead but to the darker margins of the path, the gutters, the recesses between gas lamps, the areas where guilt would lurk. Harding had a few minutes' head start, but Holmes was familiar with the man's pace, attitude, and, most importantly, the shape of his terror. He won't run far, Holmes mumbled, not breaking stride. He isn't clever enough to vanish. Not unless he is meeting someone. We reached the corner of the mews, where a narrow arch led to a wider street. Holmes paused for a brief moment before touching the stones of the wall. They were wet in one spot and had been disturbed recently. He crouched and examined the footprint in the slush, a partial heel stamp with a trace of leather along the edge. Harding turned east, he explained. We followed. The fog had increased, forming a silvery curtain just above ankle height, dispersing the street lamps' illumination into gentle halos. Few passers-by stayed at that hour, and those who did paid little attention to two guys traveling rapidly and purposefully. At Wellington Passage, Holmes came to a halt and raised a finger. Do you smell that, Watson? I sniffed. Tobacco. But not your blend. Precisely, Turkish. Harding does not smoke pipe tobacco, but rather cigarettes. That scent isn't his. Someone else was waiting here. We're not looking for a single man. We're approaching a rendezvous. He turned into the passageway. It led onto a small square with a row of shuttered shops, a shuttered inn, and a low-bricked carriage stable at the far end. Holmes motioned for silence. We advanced together, footsteps soft. A voice carried faintly from inside the stable. I told you they'd start looking. You should have waited, Harding. Another voice cut in, female, sharp, familiar. No, you waited too long. I warned you about the cocoa. You used too much. Holmes raised an eyebrow and whispered, The lady with the green ribbon, she went on, her voice now tight with strain. They'll trace it, you fool. All the way back to Harrington's, we had weeks. And now you've blundered it. There was a low rustling, perhaps a scuffle, and then Harding's voice again, lower, pleading. I did what you told me. I got the note in, I drugged the cup. You killed him early, she hissed. What if it had failed? What if he collapsed at noon or in the street? The whole illusion would have shattered. I followed your schedule, you followed the clock. But the clock was only ever a suggestion. This was supposed to look like prophecy, not murder. Holmes had heard enough. He gestured to me and we stepped forward together into the stable's entrance. The light from a single gas lantern revealed them both clearly. Harding in his dark coat, pale eyes darting between us and the open back door. The woman standing with fierce poise, her hat now discarded, auburn hair pinned tightly back, her hands clenched in front of her skirt. She did not flinch. I knew you would follow him, Mr. Holmes, she said calmly. I hoped you would. I even left the scent you're now so proud of tracing. Then you wished to be caught, Holmes said, but not too quickly. You wanted time to see the result, to see if we believed it. I wanted you to believe it. That is the difference. Holmes stepped further into the stable, now facing them directly. You aren't Lillian Morse. There is no record of such a person in Edinburgh or anywhere else. So who are you? She tilted her chin. I was once Alice Venn. My father was Horace Venn, a barrister in Calcutta. A just man. Drelincourt ruined him. Holmes's gaze sharpened. He exposed your father during the Indian contracts dispute. He framed him. My father lost everything. He drank, then he drowned. That was the official version, but I know the truth. Drelincourt made him a scapegoat to protect his investments. My father didn't even own shares. Why not simply kill him? Holmes asked quietly, because I wanted it to mean something. I wanted him to sit in that room and believe, to feel the pressure of an invisible judgment. Not just fear death, but accept it, to feel it arrive exactly as I said it would. Even if the poison acted an hour early? Holmes said dryly. She exhaled. The body obeyed the clock. That's all anyone will remember. Harding's voice broke in. You said it wouldn't be fatal. She turned on him with withering scorn. I said the dose wouldn't be. You chose the measure. I only designed the effect. Holmes watched her unmoving. Thought you miscalculated. No, she said, a strange calm returning to her. I accounted for failure. That's why I told you. You, Holmes. You were the second clock. The one who would prove it happened just as promised. He gave a single unreadable nod. And now you've told us everything. Not quite. Her eyes narrowed. There's a letter in my coat, open it. You'll find my name, my history, the truth of it all. I wrote it before the cup was ever filled. She stepped forward slowly, offering her wrists. I'll be taken quietly. That was part of the plan too. Holmes nodded to me, and I moved to retrieve the letter while he stepped between Harding and the doorway. The valet had no fight left in him. He dropped to the hay-strewn floor and buried his face in his hands. By the time Lestrade arrived, breathless and irritable, the two of them were seated separately on wooden crates, silent and resigned. Holmes handed over the letter with no ceremony. She built the illusion, he said. He carried it out. Lestrade's eyes widened as he skimmed the opening paragraphs. You're telling me she scheduled a man's death like a theater curtain rising? I'm telling you, Holmes said. She directed it. However, she underestimated the unpredictability of science and of accomplices. He returned his attention to the woman, Alice Venn, who had been stripped of her names and illusions. I suspect this was never about killing him cleanly, he told me. It was about symbolism, about the narrative. You turned a death into a myth, but you forgot. Myths don't stand up to scrutiny. I do not believe in prophecy. She looked at him and smiled, which surprised me much. But you believed in the clock, she explained. And that's all I needed. When we returned to Baker Street that night, Holmes sank into his chair and didn't talk. The case was over, but his mind had not yet let it go. Only when I fetched him a drink and gently placed it on the table did he stir. I have always trusted facts, he added calmly. But it seems some murderers now trust stories. He stared at the flames, and his expression did not convey triumph, only a haunted comprehension. By the time Holmes spoke again, the fire had died down considerably. I'd already replenished it, watching the embers flare and settle while he sank into his chair, his fists steepled beneath his chin, his eyes dark and far away. As the hour passed, the shadows shifted across the room, softening the edges of the Persian rug and blurring the book-lined walls. When he finally stirred, he did it slowly as if he hadn't finished thinking. She created the illusion of fate, he told me. Not by supernatural means, but via structure, pressure, and preparation. The illusion of inevitability is the most powerful tool a manipulator has. I nodded. However, the poison still struck too soon. She created the story, but it collapsed in the end. Holmes's eyes shifted to mine. No, it did not collapse. Rather, it shifted. In her perspective, it was successful. I frowned. How could she think like that? The man died without a script. Her timing was incorrect. Not by enough to break the illusion, Holmes whispered. That is what makes it so insidious. She created a clock that allowed for error. Drelincourt was supposed to die about the allotted time. She didn't need the poison to take effect exactly at 2:31. She only needed us to believe that he couldn't have died any other way. That his death was stitched into the hour. And we almost did. The words chilled me. I remembered the astonished silence, the stillness of the corpse, and the uncanny peace of the room at 31 minutes past 2. We had stood in reverent disbelief, as if death had answered a bell. Holmes leaned forward and tapped the side of his glass thoughtfully. She put the concept in the observers rather than the victim. Her performance required witnesses. Drelincourt was only a canvas. She said she needed you to believe it, I remembered. That you were the second clock, Holmes nodded slowly. Because I'd checked the time, confirmed the impossibility, and once the impossible is proved by a rational intellect, all that remains is to wonder. He stood quickly, restless once more, and strode to the window. The streets outside were quieter now. London's fog had begun to lift, replaced by the heavy quiet of post-midnight calm. Did you notice, he asked without turning, how readily Drelincourt followed the instructions he received? Yes, I answered. He obeyed the letter exactly, even if it didn't make sense, despite the fact that it instructed him not to move, and to remain in a specific room for an unspecified period of time. He obeyed out of fear of meaninglessness, not death. He wanted the prophecy to be true. He decided to believe. Because guilt makes men seek punishment, I answered gently. Holmes turned away from the window. Exactly. He returned to the sideboard and retrieved a folder from beneath the dispatch box. Inside were photocopies of newspapers, shipping documents and scraps of correspondence from Drelincourt's time in India. He spread them on the table as I joined him. Drelincourt's dealings with the Calcutta contracts have always been murky, Holmes told reporters. Profitable but unclear. Several men fell during the investigations. Her father, Horace Venn, was prevented from practicing law following allegations of financial misappropriation. But the records are ambiguous, and the trial, albeit brief, left many things unsolved. She believed Drelincourt had arranged the fall. She believed her father was the scapegoat for something larger. And whether real or not, it determined her purpose. Holmes picked up one of the yellowed clippings. This is what I've missed. Emotional logic. Logic that is based on belief rather than proof. She translated her belief into an edifice of inevitability. That's what made her dangerous. He sat down more slowly this time and folded his hands. She discovered Harding in London, a servant with debts, little opportunities and a rising disdain for his boss. She told him the story and offered him the opportunity to be part of something bigger. Not just a killer, but a witness to fate. I looked at him. She promised him safety. She promised him the meaning. Even shame can be captivated by this. There was a prolonged pause. Then I asked, "Do you regret not stopping it?" Holmes looked up at me. There was no hesitancy in his eyes. "No," he replied. "We were too late by design. When we were summoned, the equipment had already begun to run. She set the wheels in motion weeks ago, with cocoa orders, fake notes, and borrowed identities. We weren't invited to stop the murder. We were asked to confirm the poetry. The room became quiet again, but we did unravel it," I remarked. "We exposed the illusion. The law will convict them both." Holmes nodded, but his countenance was gloomy. "Yes, however, others will read about it in the press, and some may speculate that the death was predetermined. That a man received a letter predicting his hour and died on it." He leaned back, his tone almost sour. "So the myth persists. People want to believe in fate, in something larger, even when it kills." I poured us each another glass and set his gently on the table. He accepted it absently, and we sat silently for a while, the fire down to low coals. Then he said more softly than before, "We must remain vigilant, Watson. This new species of criminal, one who manipulates belief rather than evidence, is more dangerous than any knife wielder in a dark alley. You think we'll see more of them?" "I know. As long as there are minds thirsty for mystery, there will be people who supply it, draped in prophecy, wrapped in certainty." He fell quiet again, and I let the quietness linger. Finally, he rose and approached the mantel, reaching for his instrument. "Come," he instructed. "Let's chase away ghosts, even the ones who adhere to clocks." And when the first low, sorrowful note rose in our sitting room, I felt the weight of the case settle, not as relief, but as echo, because Holmes was correct. Some crimes do not leave any fingerprints, only belief. The following morning brought neither fanfare nor finality. A heavy mist hung over London's rooftops, transforming Baker Street into a quiet corridor of greys and shadows, with only the occasional rattle of wheels or bark of a distant vendor breaking the silence. I awoke to see Holmes sitting in the corner chair, fully dressed, fingers interlocked beneath his chin. His violin lay on the floor beside him, undisturbed since the early hours. The kettle on the hob had gone cold. "You didn't sleep," I murmured, pushing the fog from my eyes. "Sleep is a poor companion when the mind is incomplete," he said quietly, not looking up. I put the stale tea down the sink and began to boil fresh water. Holmes had been silent the previous night, but I suspected his thoughts were as active as any inquiry he had ever conducted. Despite the fact that the arrests had been made and the confession had been secured, he appeared to be missing something. "She orchestrated every step," I announced, breaking the silence. "The phony name, correspondence, and message in the study. She even made us believe she was surprised by the death. But she wasn't." "No," Holmes agrees. "Alice Venn calculated everything. And she almost accomplished something I had never seen in a killer before. The translation of cause into happenstance. She crafted a story so elegantly that it needed no additional explanation. He stood abruptly and moved to the windowsill, looking out through the foggy glass. But there's one detail that bothers me still. I paused while making the tea. Only one. He returned my gaze, his expression as cold as the air. The second letter. I blinked. The one instructing Drelincourt to remain in the study? Yes, she delivered it, but the language was incorrect. You remember it, Watson? I thought for a moment. You will remain in the study till 3 p.m. tomorrow. To do otherwise is to risk more than death. Holmes nodded. Exactly. Not death. More than death. That phrase wasn't dramatic. It was particular. She wanted him to be terrified, but of what? He feared being wrong, I remarked. He feared that she knew something he didn't, that she controlled something invisible. Holmes's voice became unexpectedly low and slow. And what if she did? He returned to the table, pulling a folded piece from beneath the ashtray. I recognized it right away, a message placed in her coat pocket during the stable arrest. He'd just read it once last night. Now he gave it to me. The writing was tidy, with lines arranged like a court declaration. In it she identified herself as Alice Venn, the daughter of Horace Venn, a former Calcutta barrister. She detailed her father's disgrace, as well as the legal collapse caused, she claimed, by Drelincourt's evidence and altered financial documents. She accused the late peer of withholding exculpatory documents, which led to her father's disbarment, madness, and final suicide. The letter had no self-pity. It read like a definitive verdict. However, in the final paragraph, one line stood out, and he knew. He always knew I had the original document. That's why he obeyed. I looked up. Holmes paid special attention to me. She never showed it to him, I explained. No, but she informed him that it existed. And he believed her, which means it must have. Holmes turned and crossed back to the window, as if expecting something to emerge from the fog. We were so caught up in the drama of the murder that we overlooked the portion that made it possible. Guilt. He spoke slowly now, as if reassembling a riddle he had previously thought completed. Drelincourt did not sit in that chair to await his fate because he feared he would die. He did so because he was afraid that if he moved and broke the sequence, she might reveal something worse than death, something that may jeopardize the legacy he had so carefully built. She didn't simply threaten his life. She jeopardized his reputation, which he valued more. Precisely. I sat gently, my tea forgotten. Then the motivation wasn't only retribution, it was blackmail. Holmes twisted his lips into a nasty grimace, a poetic one. She was well aware that a public scandal, even if it occurred after her death, would permanently tarnish the Drelincourt name. But she used that opportunity to make him a collaborator in his own demise. She didn't kill him with poison, Watson. She killed him with certainty. And the document? She's still got it. Of course she does. It was the anchor for everything. The assurance. Harding was her instrument. Coco was her approach. But that paper, wherever it is, was her blade. A knock on the door came at that very moment. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram, her look apprehensive, as if even messages were a threat anymore. Holmes took it, opened it, and read in silence. From Lestrade, he said finally. Alice Venn has refused legal counsel. She has only one request, that a sealed envelope in her possession be delivered to a specific solicitor upon her sentencing. There are no other details. He folded the telegram. That'll be the document or a copy. She has saved it as a last act of control. She never meant to vanish, I remarked quietly. She meant to linger, Holmes nodded. As an idea, as a narrative. She created a narrative that guarantees her success even in failure. He returned to his chair and rested in it. I've faced clever men, he said. Killers who employed reasoning, disguise, and even science. But Alice Venn used a narrative. She wrote a play in which death took its cue, and the audience, us, believed every word. The fog had begun to lift in earnest. Shapes sharpened. Horses clattered into view, and London's regular movements resumed. But now I understood what Holmes meant when he said this case will linger. We had solved the how and discovered the who, but the why was bigger. It belonged not only to Alice Venn, but also to the audience she knew would read about it in newspapers, discuss about it at tea, and pass it down in whispers for years to come. As I went for my pen and opened my notebook, Holmes leaned back and closed his eyes. Be careful, Watson, he muttered. Words can kill. However, they can also immortalize, and when I put pen to paper, I realized this was one case I would never write for entertainment, just to remember. The envelope arrived 2 days later, hand-delivered by a junior clerk from the law firm Cattermole and Finch, as Holmes predicted. The young man handed it with a formality that belied his youth, stating that it had been instructed by a client currently remanded at Holloway Jail and was to be delivered immediately to Mr. Sherlock Holmes's hands. He went quickly after that, not waiting for a response. Holmes did not open it immediately. He turned it over gently, as if inspecting an artifact excavated from an ancient crypt. The seal was heavy and purposeful, with a blank wax circle, no crest or emblem, just a smoothed curve as if the sender refused to claim any identification at all. For some minutes he just held it, elbows on knees, fingers wrapped around the edges. "She sends this not as a confession," he said at last, "but as an epilogue." I said nothing. Despite being formally closed, the case remained in our flat. It clung in the corners like incense, subtle yet persistent. Holmes's mood had not improved. His mind stayed stiff, not from a lack of clarity, but because of the aftertaste of manipulation. And now, with this envelope, the narrative has come full circle. He shattered the seal. Inside was a folded sheet of cream paper with a single page of precise calligraphy. Not her official hand, the stiff machine-like lettering used to write the death notice, but her private one. I instantly recognized the strokes from the letter Holmes had read in the stable. Her actual voice. Controlled but human, Holmes read aloud, "Dear Mr. Holmes, I am writing with finality, not regret. Your presence in this case was just as important as the poison itself. You lent it legitimacy. You've made it real. I appreciate your precision, timing, and willingness to play your part without knowing. The enclosed document is what Lord Drelincourt feared above all. It showed his guilt in a court of conscience, not a court of law. He signed it. My father didn't, that's all. Let them burn it. Let them file it. Let them disregard it. I don't care. The story is completed, A.V. There was a second, smaller sheet tucked behind the first, aged, creased, and stamped with the faded ink of an international financial transaction. Lord Drelincourt's signature appeared at the bottom, written in a long, precise hand. There was no counter-signature. The inference was clear. Drelincourt had withdrawn monies from an account that was apparently jointly owned. Funds intended for the Venn barristerial firm's legal protection arm were quietly removed during a scandal, and later misattributed to Horace Venn. No court would try him right now, but his ghost had already been tested. Holmes carefully folded the papers before sliding them back into the envelope. He stood and walked to the fireplace, staring at the low-burning embers. For a moment I thought he meant to destroy it. Instead, he placed the envelope in the corner of the mantel, beneath the framed clipping from the Times obituary column, which 2 mornings ago eulogized Lord Drelincourt with the usual platitudes: a respected peer, a quiet life, a death without scandal, a lie. Now delicately wrapped in wax and ash. "Do you believe she won?" I asked. Holmes turned away from the hearth. She accomplished what she set out to do. She staged a death, concealing her weapons with emotion and precision, and ensuring that the audience, us, the public, and the press, believed something unprovable. Even now, with the truth in our hands, the myth endures. He walked to the window and looked down on the street below, where a grocer's cart rattled by and 2 boys chased it on foot, laughing. "She is locked away," he said softly, "but I wonder if she does not sleep more soundly than Drelincourt ever did." That afternoon Lestrade paid a visit. He arrived in his usual staccato of steps, brushing off his coat and placing his bowler on the rack with an air of unfinished business. Holmes received him with a nod but no smile. "I've read the document," Lestrade said, removing a copy of the letter from his coat. "The prosecution's in a difficult position. It's damning, yes, but not quite admissible. Not as evidence. The real case is already closed." Holmes nodded. "Of course it is." Lestrade leaned back. "She won't contest her sentence. And Harding has folded entirely. He claims he didn't know the full extent, but admits to preparing the cocoa. He'll see prison, but she'll be studied," Holmes said. "By scholars, by dramatists, perhaps by the general people. She built a death that followed the clock, not the hand. That lingers." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "Makes the rest of us look old-fashioned." "It makes the rest of us look honest," Holmes clarified. She committed murder, no matter how precise her choreography. Lestrade stayed for tea, and we talked about other cases, one involving a fraud ring in Islington, another about a missing governess, but the Drelincourt case hung over us. Even as the hours passed and the lamps turned on one by one outside, Holmes seems reluctant to let the situation go. After Lestrade left, Holmes returned to his chair and, strangely, grabbed for his violin. But he didn't play. He just held it. "It is a dangerous thing," he said, "to make death feel beautiful." I looked at him. She made it seem inevitable. "There is a difference." Holmes nodded, but his expression remained impassive. We spent the remainder of the evening in silence. I took more care than usual to record the last notes in my journal, leaving out none of the philosophical turns or intangible weight that this case had left behind. I suspected that of all the Sherlock Holmes stories I'd written, this would be the least understood, and possibly the most enduring. I discovered that not all crimes end with a gavel or a noose. They finish when the last believer gives up. But in the case of Alice Venn, I was not positive that moment would ever come. And when I peered across the room at Holmes, his face half in shadow, I wondered whether, in some deep and private part of himself, even he still held a shard of the story she'd created so skillfully. It was, after all, her real weapon. Not the poison, but there is a prophecy. The following week saw a soft thaw in the chill that had gripped London, not just in terms of weather, but also in mood. The fog lifted a little earlier each morning, the sunlight shone brighter in the afternoons, and even the street lamps seemed less required. Life resumed its usual routine, but at 221B Baker Street, there was still an unsettling echo of the incident that had so profoundly tested our sense of logic, timing, and truth. Holmes had resumed his customary routine, but with a meditative slowness. He had returned to monographs, this time reading an old treatise on the psychology of misdirection, but even as he read, I could tell his mind was still entwined with the woman who had, for a brief while, controlled both death and its story. Late one evening after supper, as we sat opposite each other in the amber glow of the fire, I finally asked what had been on my mind for days. "Holmes," I asked, "what was the final flaw? What gave her away? How did you know she wasn't who she claimed to be?" He looked up from his seat, his fingertips delicately caressing the bridge of his nose. "There were several threads," he explained slowly, "but the first and most damning was her presence." I frowned. "Her presence?" "She arrived with the letter," he said, "a death announcement. Nonetheless, she claimed to have had no involvement in its creation and no awareness of its specifics. She pretended surprise, even terror, at the prediction. But Watson, what lady receives an anonymous threat against another man and then comes to witness its fulfillment without informing anyone? No, terror did not drive her to Drelincourt's house. It was curation." He leaned forward to warm his fingers by the fire. She needed to be seen. By me, by Drelincourt, by anyone who could see the moment the prophecy came true. She gave her identity just enough emotional weight to appear credible, but not enough to warrant scrutiny. The niece of a business associate, a brother suffered a loss. A calm sense of discontent, all too measured. Too symmetrical, I nodded. And Harding? He was crucial to her time. A servant who understood the house's rhythms. She needed a hand. On the inside, someone to give the poison without knowing of the complete scheme. He thought he was bringing payback. She was delivering theatre. And the prophecy, the timing, was not prophecy at all, Holmes remarked. It was architecture. She used a slow-acting toxin that was precisely dosed and administered in the cocoa hours earlier. Then she cemented the idea of 2:31 p.m. in everyone's minds. Drelincourt got the second letter, which was an order disguised as a threat to remain in the study. He obeyed. Fear of revelation rather than death. And so, as she expected, death arrived exactly where it was supposed to. He stood now, pacing gently beside the fire. She told the world that a death will occur at a specific moment. Then she ensured all the conditions were appropriate for it to occur. But what made it brilliant, what made it so dangerous, was that we felt it was impossible. And by doing so, we accepted the myth as true. "And yet," I responded, "you dismantled it." Holmes smiled faintly and sardonically. "Yes, but not quickly. nor before she had her audience, nor before the myth became established. I discovered the wires beneath the illusion, but the act had already ended. The curtain had dropped. He turned back toward me. She wasn't interested in escape. She was fascinated in immortality, the kind you get not with bombs or bullets, but with precision, silence, and an audience that doesn't understand they're cheering for the villain. I reached for my notepad, but I hesitated to open it. There are some stories, I continued, that cannot be reduced to words. They linger because of what they suggest rather than what they establish. Holmes nodded. That is how her story will be remembered. Not because she murdered a man, but she convinced the world that fate had done it for her. Finally, I opened the journal. The pen felt heavier than usual in my hand. Holmes returned to the window, silently observing the lamplight shimmer across the wet street beyond. I stated, in the case of the announced death, the killer did not escape. But her idea worked. She struck not only at a man, but at a certainty. That cause and effect are always aligned, that time is never deliberate, that prophecy is merely superstition. She used ink, forethought, and a poisoned cup to break down those certainties, and Holmes, who rarely questioned what was true, was forced, for one dreadful hour, to halt. The case was closed. But somewhere, I believe, a clock still